the liturgical calendar, I have a feeling a lot of us did not have that experience growing up. I know I didn't. I only learned about the church year not too long ago. Maybe for that reason, I find it pretty interesting that the whole year is divided up into all kinds of special times and holy days that tell basically the story of Jesus. The year begins with the first Sunday of Advent, and that's next Sunday. And there's 4 Sundays of Advent where we're looking forward to and hoping that Jesus will come into the world. And then, of course, on Christmas, that's a day where we celebrate. And the season of Christmas lasts several weeks. Christmas is followed by Epiphany, special day to me because that's my birthday. So I always like Epiphany. The day that we think about Jesus being revealed to the world. And then maybe the next Sunday is called Baptism of the Lord Sunday. And then what's called Ordinary Time until we get to Lent and Easter, which tell the story of Jesus's arrest and crucifixion and then ultimately resurrection. And then more ordinary time that includes Pentecost, the birthday of the church, and then more ordinary time where we think about Jesus's ministry and also the growth of the church in the first century. And then the last Sunday of the year comes around. And that's the Sunday that's today. It has 2 names. It's sometimes called Christ the King Sunday, and sometimes it's called the Reign of Christ Sunday. So if you think of that whole year, that whole church year telling the story of Jesus, the story ends with tonight's lesson. And that is that Jesus is victorious. Now, what that means, we'll kind of dig into in just a couple of minutes. But for some people over the centuries, it's been a time to think of Jesus coming again, coming back into the world. But however you may think of Jesus victorious, Jesus as triumphant, tonight is the night we celebrate that. Now, I hope you printed off the bulletin for tonight. I always like to find a picture that sums up what our worship service is about. So when I typed into Google, Christ the King, and also the Reign of Christ, all the pictures that came up were Jesus as a triumphant warrior, as a king, pictures that showed almost like a military theme, Jesus as victorious. A lot of the pictures, actually, I think all the pictures I found had a very European centric viewpoint. So blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, you can kind of picture that. And when I thought about, well, what's the image? What image would I like to share with Open Table for Christ the King Sunday? I considered also the book of Revelation, because the writer of that book was writing about what he, John of Patmos, what he thought a triumphant Jesus looked like. And his picture that he painted with his words were Jesus on a white horse, carrying a sword, ready to go into battle, riding out to defeat the enemy who for the first century Christians was mostly the Roman Empire. That's what they pictured with Christ the King. You know, as we look at other examples of art and writings from the first century, we still kind of see that theme. Among other things, in the first century, Christians were thinking that Jesus was coming back very soon. We know that there's some writings that talk about, you know, don't get married, don't bother to start a family because, you know, Jesus is coming soon. Well, that was 2,000 years ago, and it didn't happen exactly the way people were expecting. They also thought if Jesus comes soon in the first century, he is going to lead his people to battle the oppressive Roman Empire. So they were looking forward to a political victory, that the people who had been marginalized and oppressed so terribly by the Roman Empire were going to win, and that Jesus would lead them. And then if they thought about it even further, they thought about, well, what happens next? And they thought of an afterlife that was in a large part based on Greco-Roman ideas of heaven and hell, what they called the Elysian Fields and Hades. So for some, Jesus' second coming was moving on to that next realm. That's still first century ideas of Christ the King, of the reign of Christ. Now, when they thought of who Jesus comes back and saves or rescues or rewards, they also had specific ideas about that. In the first century, they thought, well, Jesus will come back and save the people who kept the faith. And that's the theme of the book of Revelation. Keep the faith. Jesus is coming soon. It'll all work out. You know, the first century Christians were persecuted very, very much by the Roman Empire. They also thought, well, Jesus will come back and save and rescue, reward the people who did the best job of following all the rules and regulations that they were supposed to follow. You know, the first century Christians were very closely related to the Jewish Pharisees, the Jewish folks who followed the law of Moses about diet and all the rules that they had to follow. And in the first century, many first century Christians were also following lots and lots of rules and laws so that they would be on the right side when Jesus came back, when Jesus was triumphant, when Christ the King would be victorious. And finally, they thought, well, Jesus will come back and save and rescue and reward the people who kept themselves apart. There were some people in the first century who thought that the most important thing was to stay separate, to stay apart. And we see that all throughout the New Testament. We see that when first century Christians were having debates about whether to follow the law of circumcision, or whether they should follow the dietary laws, or whether it was okay to eat food and meat that had been sacrificed, to a god or goddess. And for many in the first century, the people that kept themselves apart were going to be saved. They were the ones that Jesus would come back and be the king for. You know, there were communities called the Essenes who would live out in the desert apart from everyone else. And later in the next few centuries, there were these people called desert mothers and desert fathers who lived out in the desert by themselves, keeping themselves pure by being separated from everybody else. So that was the ancient viewpoint of Christ the King, coming soon, coming right away, and to save those who met a certain criterion. Now, skipping ahead 2,000 years, it's kind of funny to think that so many of those ideas are still prevalent today. We might think of the people we know or we read about who spend a lot of time trying to predict when the end of the world is. So for them, even though now it's been 2,000 years, those folks are still saying Jesus is coming soon. There's a whole series of books you might have heard of called the Left Behind series. Books about what it would look like if Jesus came back and it was the end of the world. There's a lot of folks who are still looking forward to that today. And when they think of what are the criterion for Jesus to save some and not others, well, for some, it's based on faith. Based on faith. Maybe Jesus would come back and save the people who believed the right things. Maybe people who were baptized, or people who made a profession in church that they accepted Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior. Maybe that would be the thing that would cause Jesus to save them. Or for others, maybe Jesus saving them will be based on works and actions. I know when I was growing up, we were taught you had to go to church every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. You should read the Bible every day because they will ask, who are the daily Bible readers? And you wanted to be able to raise your hand. I am. No dancing, no drinking, all kind of rules to follow about what would make us the ones that Jesus would come back and rescue, come back and save. And finally, there are still folks who think keeping separate from the general public is the best thing to do to be on the right side when Jesus comes back. Keeping yourself pure and apart from everybody else. So we all know of communities of folks who are separated, whether it's like monks and nuns in a monastic tradition, or cultural groups who live out in communities and don't mix with other people that aren't of their religion. So those ancient ideas of who Jesus is going to come back and save and help, they really haven't changed a lot in 2,000 years. People are still expecting Jesus to come and still, I guess, crossing their fingers that they're on the right side of who's in and who's out. Well, all of that to say, tonight's reading that Kara did so well from the Gospel of Matthew describes Jesus coming back in a very different way. Now, this is a parable. It doesn't always look like a parable to us when we read it, but it's a parable. It's a parable about a king who's coming back and separating sheep and goats. And the parable is so thinly disguised that some people, when they read it, they think it literally is Jesus as a king and Jesus coming back. But I believe it's a parable, a great parable, but still just a story that uses symbols to help us understand what kind of king Jesus is. Because today is Christ the King Sunday. So, let's figure that out. What kind of king is Jesus? Well, this story that we just read is unique to Matthew. It's not in the other synoptic gospels, Luke or Mark. It's not in the other gospel, John. It's not anywhere else in the New Testament. It stands alone right here. One of the things that I think is so interesting now, when I consider the long introduction that I gave you, is that in this parable, what's not mentioned in the king separating the people that the king is pleased with and those that he's not pleased with. What's not mentioned? That they had the right faith, that they were baptized, that they said their prayers every day or daily Bible readers, It doesn't say how many times you went to church. It doesn't say all those things that so many of us either grew up or still kind of think those are the most important things. It doesn't say those at all. But it does say something, and now here's the heart of the text. Here's the heart of the message. What does matter? In this parable, what matters is whether or not we do works of justice and compassion. What does matter if we're doing good for others? And who are those others? Well, it doesn't mention you took care of your family. It doesn't say you were a good boss and you led your business to make a profit. It doesn't say you took care of the pastor, although that one's not so bad to keep in mind, but it doesn't say any of those things, does it? Who does this important lesson say who you should take care of? And y'all know if we were at meeting in person, I would get y'all to shout it out because y'all know the answer. It's the hungry. It's the thirsty. It's the stranger. The person who's naked or sick or in prison. That's what matters. That's the group of people that Christ the King is calling out to us to help. And the reading Kara did was kind of long. And do you know why? Because that reading repeats the message 4 times. 4 times. At first you must have thought, well, why does it keep repeating itself? Why does it keep saying, did you feed the poor? Did you give somebody who's thirsty something to drink? Did you help the sick and those in prison? Why did it say it 4 times? And the answer is so obvious. Emphasis. It's like, if you fell asleep through part of that story, you're still going to get it because it's going to be said 4 times. And that's how important it is. That's what kind of king Christ the King is. That's what the reign of Christ should look like. Like a world where people are more concerned with feeding and giving water to and clothing and comforting and visiting and healing others, especially as the text says, especially the least of these. The least of these. That phrase just resonates with us. The very least, not the most important, not the people that can pay us back, not the ones who are socially advantaged, not the people who we owe money to, not all kind of privileged, well-off folks. Not to say you shouldn't kind of help them too, but the people we should care about the most are the least of these. Somebody we're all familiar with, I think, Mother Teresa had a program in India about feeding the poor, and she knew poor people. She knew the hungry. She knew people who were diseased and sick and lonely and desperate. And her program was called The Least of These. That was her program. Out of all the things she could have called her program, she called it The Least of These. Now, although this particular story only appears once in the whole Bible, this message does not just appear once. This message is throughout the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. And all you have to do is pay attention. The prophets of ancient Israel, they were calling out for justice for the poor and the stranger and those in need, all throughout what we call the Old Testament. And Jesus's teachings, although this one story is never mentioned again, almost all of his actions were about helping the poor and the hungry and those without. He never turned anybody away. And we see it in the work of the early church. And we see it in the lives and the actions of ancient and modern day saints. People like Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, Francis of Assisi, Mother Teresa, people who I think are heroes to many of us. And even in the lives and the actions of people closer to home. Jerry and I had a friend at Eastwood, Scott Jameson, who started a church that was located in the prison in Nashville. And it was a Disciples of Christ. I hope it still is. I haven't heard from him in a while, but a Disciples of Christ new church started in prison. What a wonderful place to start a church. But, I'd also say people that started open and affirming churches like Eastwood and New Covenant and Open Table. Making a church for people who might not have been welcomed anywhere else. Or I think of other saints closer to home, like my friends who used to volunteer at Room in the Inn. I know Sharon and Janet and Joe used to go every chance they got and took their family and their friends to provide food and company to the people, the homeless people who were seeking shelter at Room in the Inn. Or organizations that many of us have been a part of, like Charity Water, Bread for the World, Feeding America. Those are very worthwhile charities helping to provide food to those in need. So as we get ready to close, I hope you're thinking, how can we do this? How can we do more? So I've asked Janice if she'll put up on the screen a page from our church website. And it's a page that shows the social justice ministries that we all are a part of. And what we have been doing for the past few years is taking a special focus every 2 months. So you can see for the past year, January and February were about programs that provided lights for people who didn't even have the basic need of lighting. We collected money. We showed these beautiful devices called Lucy lights that did not need electricity and could provide lighting for people in homes who didn't have that. In March and April, we focused on care of creation. And among other things, we've talked about starting a Green Chalice organization at Open Table, and we learned more about what we could do to protect the environment, protect our planet. In May and June, one of our favorite activities, collecting money for Charity Water, a very worthwhile organization that provides a good, clean, safe drinking water to people in places all over the world where they don't have that most basic necessity. In July and August, we were looking at wellness and volunteering for different agencies that were helping people, children with serious diseases. And going into September and October, another favorite time of the year for Open Table, a period to focus on reconciliation, where we would enjoy experiences with other churches, maybe of different ethnic backgrounds, with churches that were open and affirming. We participated in Borough Pride every year that it's been held. And then finally, November and December, a time to focus on feeding the hungry. We've helped with the coldest night for the past 4 or 5 years. This year, they're changing their program a little bit. You may have noticed we haven't talked a lot about the coldest nights. They are still operating to provide food, though they now require the donor to, I think, provide 50 meals. And that's probably a good activity for a big group, but it's harder to do for 1 or 2 people. But we will continue to find ways to help the coldest night, help other groups that are hungry. That's a way to answer this call that's seen in this parable about reaching out to the least of these. You know, besides doing these things through church, and Janice, you can pull that down whenever you want to. I encourage all of us to get involved individually. I bet we all have our favorite charities to give to. I know a lot of us like to give to animal programs, maybe the Humane Society, ASPCA, Rutherford County Cat Rescue. There's a lot of worthwhile organizations, because just because the king in the parable didn't say the little dogs and cats that don't have a home doesn't mean that they too aren't among the least of these when they don't have somebody to take care of them. So, so I encourage you to work through our church programs, but also find the charities and the nonprofits that touch your hearts. In just a few weeks, I'll be mentioning to you about Journeys in Community Living. This time of year, we always need Christmas presents for the adults with disabilities that that get services at the agency where I work. Many of you have done that. We've done that for several years. So that'll be coming up again. I'd also like to mention that December 1st, which is coming up very soon, is World AIDS Day. And there are programs that help people with AIDS, both in our country, but around the world, where it's still a terrible, terrible disease affecting so many people. So tonight, let's hear this call from Jesus that's told through this parable in Matthew. And let us remember that when we care for the least of these, we are caring for Jesus. Amen.